Good afternoon or good morning. Thanks everyone for attending today's webinar, CMMC and 800-171 in Government Contracting and Higher Education. I'm Jim Shreve. I'm Chair of the Cybersecurity Practice at Thompson Coburn, and I'd like to welcome you. This is part of a roughly monthly series of webinars that Thompson Coburn does on various privacy and cybersecurity topics. Before we begin today, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can submit them through the Q&A widget that's at the bottom of your screen. We'll try and answer these questions during the webcast, but if there's a fuller answer that's needed or if we run out of time, we'll answer later by email. A copy of today's slide deck is available in the resource widget, and you can find additional answers to some common technical issues located in the Help widget at the bottom of your screen. The webinar today is CLE accredited in California and Illinois for 1.0 hours of general CLE credit, in Missouri for 1.2 hours of general CLE credit, and in Texas for 1.0 general credit, which is pending. We award CLE based on attendance for the entire 60 minutes. From time to time, you'll be required to click a pop-up screen to reflect your continued engagement. Your CLE certificate will be emailed to you later this afternoon once we've verified your attendance. The widget at the bottom of your screen saying certificate will only show whether or not you have earned the certificate. We value your opinions and appreciate your participation in the webinar today. So again, welcome. For today's webinar, we have a great panel of speakers, some people in the law firm, as well as a longtime friend, Shawn Malone. If I could ask the speakers to introduce themselves, beginning with Christine.
Hi, everyone. My name is Christine Cuvion. I'm an associate at Thompson Coburn. I work with government contractors, advising them to how to stay compliant with various FAR and DFARS regulations, and also represent them in litigation and investigations brought by the government. I spent some time advising the agency that is now CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency within the Department of Homeland Security, and working with them on their procurements, which gave me a lot of insights into how the agency works. I throw it over to Shawn.
Well, thanks, Christine. Hello, everyone. My name is Shawn Malone, and I'm founder and CEO of Security Diligence, which is a consulting and advisory services company focused on information security, privacy, and risk management, with key practice areas in cybersecurity and third-party risk. Currently spend a fair amount of my time providing virtual CISO services to a number of clients, providing high-level strategic project management advisory and consulting to several clients. And I also provide expert witness services in the area of third-party cyber risk. I am currently working with one of my clients on preparing them for CMMC assessment in the near future, and they are a small to medium-sized firm, which is what this activity from DoD is focused really on, and we'll talk about that as we go through the rest of the presentation. Glad to be here and looking forward to an engaging webinar. Jeff?
Thank you, Shawn. Hello, my name is Jeff Newman. I'm the chair of the Government Contracts Group here at Thompson Coburn. It's nice to be with everyone today. And for further information, my bio is online on the Thompson Coburn website, as is 3 of the 4 speakers here as well. Let me just give you a little overview of my practice and how it really relates to what we're going to talk about today. As I said, I deal with all aspects of federal, state government contracting, focus on civilian and defense contractors, including a lot of education providers to the U.S. government, providing and who provide services, but also receive federal funding from the Department of Education and other agencies for procurement purposes. We've been seeing over the last couple of years, and it's really ramped up since late last year, questions about CMMC, NIST 800-171, and all of these cybersecurity requirements and regulations that we're going to talk about today. As I said, part of our practice here at the firm in the Government Contracts Group is to help contractors, like many of the participants or the attendees on the phone today, navigate these compliance obligations to make sure that they don't run afoul of these requirements, which in this case, are awfully complex in terms of implementation, but also just the timing of these requirements, as you will see today. The government is still in some ways trying to play catch up with respect to its own auditing and evaluation criteria that it will be using to evaluate contractors going forward. So we look forward to having a dialogue with you all today. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Jeff. As I mentioned, I'm Jim Shreve, and my practice is pretty much exclusively relating to privacy and cybersecurity issues. So virtually anything that goes with data, protecting the data, how it's used, how it flows, I deal with all of that. And I deal with it for a variety of industry verticals. It could be financial institutions, healthcare institutions, government contractors, those in higher education. And in fact, I'll talk a little bit about later, I serve on an initiative with the U.S. Department of Education to develop new standards in cybersecurity for institutions of higher education. And so again, thank everyone for coming today, and thanks to our great group of speakers. So let's dive in. So let's find out some more about just what are these two standards we're talking about. So I'll hand it off to Christine.
Thanks, Jim. So the evolution of the current cybersecurity standards that we're talking about today, NIST 800-171 and CMMC, you can trace it back to FISMA, which was the Federal Information Security Management Act, passed first in 2002, 2003, and then an updated one that called the Federal Information Security Modernization Act in 2014. And both of those required a risk-based assessment of information security systems procured by the government. And after a few years, the NIST 800-171 became the standard, following a shift into cloud computing, and maybe some of you might be familiar with the authorization process for moving towards cloud computing that the government went through. So NIST 800-171 describes 14 key areas of security protocols. It works out into about 110 practices and processes, and focuses on the confidentiality of controlled unclassified information, CUI. We'll get a little bit more into CUI in the next couple slides. But so it really applies to any non-federal system that processes, stores, or transmits CUI, and anything that protects those components of that system. So NIST 800-171 compliance was actually required as of a few years ago for any system that fits those criteria, that processes, stores, or transmits CUI. But until recently, it's been a self-certification process, and there's not been any verification on the government side. That's something that's changed recently with the introduction of CMMC. So let's talk a little bit more about when NIST 800-171 applies. It talks about, it focuses on, is there a contract requirement that involves CUI? So if you're a government contractor, what information are you getting from the government? It really only applies to government information, which is information that the government creates or information that an entity creates or possesses on behalf of the government. So if your institution or company is not getting information from the government, then you have less to worry about here. but a lot of times this pops up in ways you wouldn't expect. You might get information from the government that maybe you're not thinking about. So let's dig in a little bit more. If your contract includes, if you work for the government and you have a contract with the government, and it includes DFARS, 252, 204, 7008, you're working with government information, and that clause requires you to comply with NIST 800-171. So let's talk a little bit more about what controlled and classified information is. As I said, it's government information primarily, or information that is created on behalf of the government. And it's the old information. So before CUI became the term of art, there were a lot of different acronyms, FOUO, SBU, lots of other labels that were agency specific. And NIST 800-171 was the government's first attempt to standardize the way that data is treated. So if you are, for instance, if you are a government contractor that doesn't work on CUI, you have different regulations. But or if you are only a commercial off-the-shelf producer selling commercial off-the-shelf products to the government, then you're not as involved in these requirements. So after the CUI rule was passed fairly recently, I think in 2018, the agencies, there's two categories of CUI, CUI basic and CUI specific. And CUI specific is a series of categories. There's a CUI registry that's in our resources slide we'll get to in a bit, that gives you levels of types of information, categories of information, if you will, that let you know, well, what kind of information do I need to pay attention to? What kind of information are we getting that has to meet these NIST 800-171 requirements? CUI basic is pretty much anything that's not specified that fits the overall definition of CUI. So I'm going to throw it over to Shawn to talk a little bit more about CMMC.
All right, thank you, Christine. So let's talk a little bit about CMMC and what, excuse me, and what that is. CMMC takes the 800-171 and a self-certification process that Christine mentioned that was required by December 31st, 2017, and moves to a trust but verify model. So CMMC is designed to verify that you're meeting certain requirements along the CMMC maturity scale from 1 to 5. It is a unifying standard, and it's designed to apply to all contractors and subcontractors across the defense industrial base. It is a maturity framework, and as you go up from CMMC 1 through CMMC 5, the requirements to meet those specific levels and be certified at those levels, of course, increases, along with the maturity of your program. Provides assurance through the supply chain. This is really designed to go down the supply chain to the very initial suppliers of, in some cases, raw materials. And so we'll see how, in a few slides, how there's a compliance requirement on each subcontractor and contractor to ensure that their own supply chains are adhering to the principles of CMMC. Certification is obtained through a third-party assessment organization, C3PAOs, which are approved and accredited through the CMMC AB, which is accreditation board. And those organizations then have trained and certified assessors that will be dispatched to various organizations to perform the CMMC assessment process required to obtain the certification at the particular level. All this was laid, all this was laid out in a DFARS interim rule that was dated September 29th of last year, with an effective date of November 30th. One of the provisions of that DFARS interim rule was to take your 800-171 self-certification that was required by the end of 2017 and essentially input your results, your basic assessment results of your 800-171 self-assessment into the Supplier Performance Risk System, or SIPR's portal that was used as part of creation of the CMMC to capture 800-171 scores and related information by contractors and subcontractors that are obligated to these requirements. CMMC is a framework, of course, that consists of processes and cybersecurity best practices from a number of sources. There are 17 domains, most of which are from FIPS 200 and 800-171. 800-171, as Christine mentioned, has 14 domains, and there are 3 added domains that are specific to the creation of CMMC, namely asset management, recovery, and situational awareness, that brings the CMMC domain count up to 17. Across those 17 domains, there are 43 capabilities, and you'll see in a later slide where we list a number of references for you. There's some great information from the CMMC website that the government's created, DoD's created, for you to dig into those domains and capabilities in more detail. So this is, I thought, was an excellent graphic directly out of the CMMC documentation from the CMMC program office. On 31 January of 2020, there was an official release and presentation from the DoD, and this was one of the graphics that was included, and it was, I thought it was nicely done to capture the different levels of CMMC and what comprises the practices within each level. So you'll see in level 2, requirements for 800-171 kick in at level 2. Level 3, where you need to be for proper control and handling of CUI, kicks in at level 3. So the 110 controls within 800-171 added to 20 specific controls for CMMC level 3 bring you to 130 practices to achieve level 3 certification. And then level 4 and 5, of course, is above that, and that gets to both a proactive and an advanced or fairly progressive information security, cybersecurity program certification level. You'll also note that 800-171B, which is enhanced security requirements for protecting CUI, is a supplement to the basic 800-171 document. That's now been replaced by 800-172 in draft form. So this chart is just slightly dated as NIST continues to evolve their various groups of documents. So when does CMMC apply? Well, it's a phased application by contract. The DoD has stated that it would be roughly a 5-year phase-in. At the end of that 5 years, all contractors and subcontractors will be expected to have the appropriate level of CMMC certification pursuant to the contracts that they're executing on. It will apply to all contractors handling CUI and other sensitive unclassified data. And as Christine pointed out in an earlier slide, CUI can come to you from a government customer. You can also create CUI in the course of providing either the services or fulfilling product under a DoD contract. So as an example that I'm most familiar with, as I have clients in this category, small to medium-sized manufacturers that are actually making products for under DoD contracts would certainly receive CUI in the form of requirements documents, and in the course of taking those requirements from their customer, DoD customer, and developing a product that gets manufactured within their facility, design specs, design documents, drawings, all those types of things get created as part of a manufacturing process in some form or fashion. And since it's tied to a contract that includes CUI being received from a government or DoD customer, that becomes CUI as well. So you can receive CUI and you can create it in the course of delivering on your contract. So let's talk about some of the key challenges with meeting CMMC and the underlying NIST guidance of 800-171. We stated before that 800-171 was a self-certification or self-assessment process with a December 2017 compliance date versus the interim rule that came out last September that says, hey, by November 30th, you need to go to this portal and put in your 800-171 self-assessment or self-certification results. And they asked for a number of pieces of information, including your system security plan identification, your cage code, which is a contractor or subcontractor number that you're assigned by the DoD and the government, as well as your 800-171 score. And your score is really tied to the number of controls in 800-171. So 110 controls in total. A perfect score would be 110. Anything less than that needed to also have a number of plans of action and milestones and how many of those there were in that. So if you had a score of 100, you would then have 10 plans of action and milestones against 10 specific controls. The challenge here is those organizations that needed to get that into the portal by November 30th of 2020 and didn't have a perfect score, the question that was raised was, well, I was supposed to be at 110 by the end of 2017. So that creates kind of a conundrum and should be discussed within your organization of whether you want to remediate before you enter into that portal or go with the lower score, even though you're supposed to be at 110 by 2017. So that was one challenge that I specifically worked through with one of my clients. Another challenge is system security plans. Those organizations and a lot of organizations, especially in the small to medium enterprise category, do not run separate business systems and IT systems just for government work. Some do, but most do not, and most have them commingled with the rest of their business. So if you're an organization that does both commercial work and DoD type work and you're commingled, your system security plan is really going to encompass your entire environment, which means your entire environment is going to be subject to CMMC and 800-171 provisions and controls. So there may be an opportunity for you to separate those out to make things a little easier, but that's certainly a challenge because your system security plan really has to be written around any systems and business processes that you use to provide services and products under the contract, and if it's commingled with a non-DoD part of your business, then it's a bigger challenge. Plans of action and milestones, those are the things that you're not compliant with from a control standpoint, and plans of action and milestones need to be documented with expected completion dates. And because of lots of dependencies within technology areas that can be a bit of a challenge as well. I mentioned this before, the supply chain management and assessment component. The intent with CMMC is to cover the entire supply chain. So as a provider of services or products to a DoD customer, you need to make sure that your supply chain, where you're getting your parts and components, if you're manufacturing some product, is following the 800-171/CMMC requirements. And you need to get some assertions from those suppliers that you use that that's the case. And it may include you having to do an assessment to make sure that they are marching to these obligations as well. Cloud services, the DFARS calls out requirements that those organizations that are providing cloud services or using cloud services to provide products or services to DoD customers need to adhere to DFARS 252.239-7010, which is the cloud computing services requirements, and adhere to the Cloud Computing Security Requirements Guide. So that is a couple of 100-page guide that details and dictates the use of cloud services for DoD contractors and subcontractors. So it's a challenge because you need to be familiar with that and you need to understand that to make sure that you're adhering to that part of the DFARS area relative to obtaining CMMC certification. And lastly, security incident reporting. The DFARS, as well as the interim rule, calls out a 72-hour reporting requirement for security incidents. And this has been a challenge historically for a lot of companies because when you first discover a security incident, there's this initial triage period that you need to go through to determine if, in fact, have you actually lost data or has data been breached? You know, what's the extent of the incident and how invasive has it been, so that you can just get to the point where you can determine whether there's been data breach or loss. And so 72 hours sounds like a long time, but having been involved in many incidences over the years myself, I can tell you that that time goes very quickly. So having a security incident response plan that pays particular attention to the high value work that needs to be done during the first few hours in the triage scenario in order to get to a place where you actually have something meaningful to report if you need to report at all. So we mentioned a couple of times that we have resource slide here. There's a number of good resources here that you can go to. There's lots of information on 800-171 CUI as well as the CMMC program itself. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jeff on government contracting issues. Jeff?
Well, thanks, Shawn. And, you know, first of all, I think Shawn and Christine's sort of summary of the rules is very helpful for whatever perspective you're dealing with when working with the government, whether you're a higher education provider, or a defense contractor, or commercial civilian contractor, what have you. I think that's a real good overview. What I'd like to do with respect to what Shawn and Christine have already said is to perhaps give you a little flavor of what some of the government contracts issues are with respect to these particular compliance requirements. And perhaps the best place to start is to bootstrap off the last slide we looked at, which was slide 10, and some of the regulatory citations. One of the things that is, as I mentioned, is awfully confusing here is we have multiple legal authorities, if you will. We have NIST 800-171. We have, interim rules, final rules, DFAR sites, FAR regulations. So let me just take a moment and give a quick summary and synopsis to try to bring some of this together from just a pure government contracts perspective of what we're seeing from the DFARS. As many of you know, the sort of two big clause, well, the real big clause actually is 252.204-712, which deals with general cybersecurity requirements. Shawn just mentioned in particular the 72-hour notice requirement of a potential cyber incident. That's a little bit different than we're talking about today with respect to, some of the protocols and controls that are in place to make sure you have a secure system. I guess we look at it as sort of the back end. If you don't have these systems in place, maybe you have a cyber incident down the road. But when you deal with 70-12, keep in mind that you may not get any CUI information at all. You may not have any access to that information. You may not have to process it, but you're still subject to the 70-12 requirement. And I think that's an important aspect to start with respect to your compliance with the government regulations, in particular the DFARS. The other sort of couple of citations to be aware of is DFARS 252.204-7019, which is the notice of the NIST 800-170 requirement, and then the follow-on clause at DFARS 252.204-7020, which is as Shawn talked about at length, the DoD assessment requirements. But a couple others are out there. Shawn mentioned also 7021, which is, DFARS 252.204-7021, which are the CMMC requirements. And then we also shouldn't forget about for those contractors that are dealing with classified information. You also have a security requirement that's set forth in the FAR, and if you deal with confidential, secret, or top secret information, you at least should be taking a look at in conjunction with these regulations, FAR 52.204-2, which are the security requirements for all government contractors, not just DoD contractors. So an important aspect to look at with respect to the regulatory regime that we're dealing with, and those are sort of the DFARS requirements that you need to look at. And so what do these requirements all mean? And as I said, I think with respect to the assessments and the dealing with NIST 800-171 and CMMC, it really requires all members of the DoD supply chain that potentially process CUI, which again is a defined term of controlled unclassified information, really to do two things to be considered for a contract award. And that is to perform that cybersecurity self-assessment that Shawn talked about earlier. And if there's any deficiencies there, and then to report that assessment to the Supplier Performance Risk System, which is SPRS is the acronym. And we have I believe, a reference to that in one of the prior slides in terms of the website. But when you deal with SIPRs, if in fact you report your score and you don't have a perfect 110, if you don't hit all the 110 points, you hit 100 as Shawn mentioned, or you hit 90 or hit on 106, it means you still have some work to do, and you have to sort of come back with some security plans and dates that you are going to remediate the situation for any shortfalls in the particular controls that you have. And just to give you a sense of what some of these 110 points, what factors are associated with those, we have everything from access controls to awareness and training, audit and accountability, configuration management, identification and authentication, and all of these really run across hardware systems, software systems, configuration management, and as I said, those are all available online, and we have some of those references to you in the slides in the slide deck here. So it's worthwhile to take a look at those and make sure that those security assessments have been completed. As mentioned, there was a November 30th requirement for contractors to complete those that were subject to these particular clauses. And certainly, in order to be eligible for award of a government contract or to be a subcontractor to a prime contractor, this has to be done. This isn't sort of an optional requirement that you may say, well, I'll get to it later or not. I mean, this is really at the forefront of what the government's looking at from a compliance perspective these days. And these cybersecurity requirements are mandatory. And as I mentioned, as we'll talk about in the discussion section, you want to make sure that these are flowed down in your prime contract, but moreover, if you're a subcontractor, that the prime has flowed these down to you. But my sense is, and just by activity that we are seeing with clients here at the law firm, and I know Shawn has echoed this as well, we're seeing a lot of activity in this area now, where contractors are coming to us and saying, what do I do? What do these clauses mean? And what are my responsibilities? Especially if you're a non-defense contractor, and by that I mean sort of one of the big system integrators, but you do a little bit of defense work, or you supply a upper tier contractor who is providing an end product to the Department of Defense. You're in the supply chain, and you very well likely are going to be subject to these particular requirements. In terms of the analysis, and we're going to talk about a lot of the issues that we've referenced now in our discussion session during the latter half of this presentation, but what's really sort of helpful to me, and I know a lot of our clients, is that what's sort of the roadmap when you get a request from a prime contractor that you need to fill out one of these certifications that you're compliant with all of the DFARS clauses that I mentioned. DFARS 252.204- blankety blank, all the different clauses, 7012, 7018, 7019, 7020. How do you go about sort of trying to figure out what to do? And one of the things we've done is sort of try to create a roadmap for you. And the way I like to look at this, I'll sort of ask myself 3 questions, and we'll sort of chew on this a little bit further later on in the presentation. But the first is, and for many of you on the call, what data are you getting? Is it covered under the definition of CUI? I mean, that's the first question you need to ask yourself. And then once you have the answer to that, it helps you sort of take a couple different paths down that roadmap that I've talked about. And the question, I think, the second question you need to ask yourself is this CUI? Is this data, whether it's CUI or you're not sure if it's CUI, is this particular data that's at issue here hitting your system, or is it sort of coming into the company such that you are accessing or potentially processing CUI data? And that's sort of the second question to ask yourself. And the third question is really 2 parts. One, if the data is hitting your system, if the data is coming into your company or your organization, what is the nature of the data? And by that I mean, where is it on your system? How broadly is it distributed? Is it being accessed by a small group of individuals, or is it being accessed by a large group of individuals? Those questions are the ones that you sort of should think about as you analyze how to respond and how to deal with sort of an initial request from a government contractor or a government customer at the agency level to assess your compliance with these requirements. And then once you know the answers to these questions, and they're sort of discrete questions, I think, you'll be able to triage, to sort of deal with the particular CUI issues if you have them, and what controls do you currently have in place, and what controls do you need to be put in place to make sure that you are covering your compliance obligations under the DFARS, under the and other corresponding regulations. And perhaps the last point I want to make is the implementation and beyond. This has been a little frustrating to the government contractor community because in terms of CMMC, as Shawn mentioned, there's going to be sort of third-party auditors coming in to evaluate an organization's compliance with the CMMC requirements. Sort of 2 issues jump out at least me personally, and for some of our clients. Number one is on a more administrative level, they haven't even sort of come out on who those CMMC evaluators are going to be to date. And so contractors who want to do these evaluations and want to get, compliant and get this behind them, we don't have that CMMC, third-party evaluators lined up yet. And then I think the more pressing concern that the government contracting community has is, we're going to let these third parties, these aren't necessarily government, officials like the Defense Contract Audit Agency or the Defense Contract management agency, for those of you who are familiar with those organizations. These very well may be, large-scale commercial companies who have the expertise to do this. And, the question is, do you want those organizations coming into your particular company, having access to your, security books and records, so to speak, to evaluate your systems? And contractors are not particularly pleased with respect to, that likelihood of, and this is in many cases a larger defense contractors, because as I said, it's a very relatively small community, and contractors are concerned about the potential consequences from having these third-party providers into their system. We're going to talk more about, I think, each of these issues toward the end of the presentation and our discussion part of the program, but I'll turn it back over to Jim right now.
Well, thanks very much. I want to talk a little bit about these requirements in the context of higher education. And I think higher education is a good illustration of an industry where sometimes it's absolutely clear that you're a government contractor. You're receiving information under a contract, and you have to apply the appropriate standard, whether that's 800-171 for CUI or it's CMMC if you're in a Defense Department contract. But sometimes it's not entirely clear. And so I think the Department of Education is itself working through this also because they have their own requirements on them as an agency that is passing on information that constitutes CUI, as well as their role sort of as a regulator and enforcement authority over many institutions. And so we look at the Department of Education. I mean, they have privacy requirements under FERPA, HIPAA, as well as cybersecurity requirements that may fall on higher education under GLBA through the safeguards rule or the identity theft red flag rule, or potentially under HIPAA as well if you have healthcare part of your enterprise. Now, there have been several issuances from the Department of Education relating to cybersecurity. Some of the requirements are passed along through a couple of major agreements, through the SAIG enrollment agreement. There are cybersecurity and data security requirements in there. The Program Participation Agreement, PPA, has some additional language on cyber and data security requirements. Federal Student Aid Handbook as well talks about cyber and data security. I would note that these requirements are the sections on those are fairly brief, and they don't tend to be terribly prescriptive. You see the same kind of general approach in a couple of important letters from Federal Student Aid in 2015, which was kind of a general reminder talking about protecting PII, what the GLBA requirements are, as well as a little discussion about FERPA privacy requirements. Again, it talks generally. It talks about kind of looking at the risks of the data and applying controls that are commensurate with the risk, much like the original safeguards rules issued several years ago. 2016, we have another letter issued. It's very similar to the 2015 one, but adds in references specifically to 800-171 and the various requirements that relate to CUI. Again, it's a short letter. It's rather general in scope and doesn't mandate a lot of specific type of controls. We also saw an issuance about enforcement under GLBA on February 28th of last year, which describes the role of the FTC in enforcing GLBA safeguarding requirements for federal student aid, and then discusses if audits find weaknesses in cybersecurity and what you need to do in that case. And just recently, we had a new issuance from the Department of Education in federal student aid on December 18th of last year. Importantly, this makes the link. It notes that GLBA information, so if you get non-public personal information under the federal student aid program, that's CUI. And so you then have to look to 800-171 and assess your compliance with it. So it announces a plan for a self-assessment effort in higher education for not only higher education institutions, but their service providers who may have access to this CUI in order to comply with the requirements of 800-171. And so I think this illustrates, I think, a trend, because we're moving in cybersecurity generally, and I would include looking at CMMC and 800-171, as well as what we're seeing from the Department of Education, is that we're moving to increasing specificity. That we're moving away from the idea that you take a look at risks and you put controls in place that are commensurate with the nature and degree of risk that you find, towards saying, okay, you have to do that, but you also have to have specific controls in place as a baseline. And I think that's what we're seeing quite a bit in this space, and what we're moving towards. And you can see that to some extent in this new Department of Education issuance from December. I would also point out that there's another initiative in the Department of Education to examine cybersecurity more generally in higher education. So they're looking to how to implement these specific requirements, like under the safeguards rule or under 800-171, but also the idea of having the systems in higher education protected to at least a certain baseline. So everything has to be secured to some extent. And so is there a way to have kind of across-the-board standards for higher education? They're not looking to create a new standard, but examining how we might have existing standards that might be broadened to cover a broader range of issues and a broader range of data and systems than they might apply to on their face. And so I would note that they've put out questionnaires, they've had meetings in DC and online to look at this, and I've been a part of those meetings to look at, okay, well, what if we expanded 800-171 to go kind of beyond just CUI? And I can tell you one thing that was a concern that was been raised is that 800-171 is just too rigid and quite often probably too high a standard for a lot of the less sensitive data that an institution of higher education might have. And so I think they also floated the idea of, well, what about the GLBA safeguards rule, which we said, well, in the current rule that might work, but we're facing the possibility of a much more prescriptive safeguards rule being issued by the FTC any day, because it's been out in proposed form now for nearly 2 years. That could be look a lot more like 171. So I think this, even though we had a change in administration, I do think that we're going to see the cybersecurity efforts at the Department of Education continue in the new administration, pretty much unabated. And all of these topics are going to be considered. And so just for your reference, here's a few of the items I mentioned that might be useful if you're in higher education, things to look at to get some of these basic points out there. So to keep us going here, I'd like to get in. We'd like to have at least a brief panel discussion. And I apologize, we may go a little over the top of the hour, because I'd like to get as many thoughts as we could here. I'd like to start off with the concept of, okay, so you've determined that these requirements may apply either by law, by regulation, or just by your contract partner. What do you need to do to get this process started? And Shawn, I'd ask your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. So getting started with the compliance process can start with doing some self-assessment work. So if you determine that these apply to you, doing a self-assessment against the current 800-171 version to see where your program aligns and does not align, or where there's gaps relative to the 110 controls in 800-171. If you do deal with CUI and you believe you're going to be at CMMC level 3, for example, then you can also add those 20 additional controls for level 3 to get to the 130 and do a self-assessment against those. So for those organizations that have information security or cybersecurity program, you can go through that NIST document and start annotating where you are in your program relative to those controls. You can also use a third-party consultant or contractor to take you through that as a formal gap assessment exercise. And sometimes that's helpful, and it allows you to not use internal resources where you may be taking somebody from what they normally do or adding additional work to one or more folks within your organization. You could use an outside third party to come in and go through a gap assessment process with you and produce a formal report and give you an idea of where you are. The key here is you want to start off by knowing where your gaps are so that you know what you need to look at long before you entertain setting up a CMMC certification assessor to come on site. Jim?
Well, thanks, Shawn. I'd like to hit just a couple of questions that have come in the education space. One is, I would say, there's a question about CMMC in the Department of Education initiative, and I think that I'm not hearing so much about CMMC specifically, but I think there is openness in the Department of Education initiative to having a maturity model like you see under CMMC, with the recognition that not all data is the same and not all institutions are the same. And so we may, in some contexts, we need probably somewhat less stringent controls, and in some we have more. And so I think that they're looking at that possibly as a model, but not so much to apply directly in the education space outside of where it applies by law to DoD contractors. And then there's also a question about GLBA. I mean, keep in mind the definition of CUI is looks to data that is required to be protected under another standard. And so what you're seeing, how you get from GLBA to CUI is if you have data that is part of the federal student aid program and constitutes non-public personal information under GLBA, then it has requirements on it to be protected, and therefore comes within the definition of CUI. And so that's how 800-171 comes into play in that context in the higher education space. So thanks for those questions. Any other thoughts on starting the compliance process? If not, it would be good. Shawn, can you talk a little bit about, everybody's been working on cybersecurity for years, and there are a multitude of standards out there, initiatives that people have been trying to meet for years. How can you leverage some of that to meet some of these requirements that may now come into play?
Sure. So as you state, Jim, a lot of organizations have been working on cybersecurity and maturing programs over the last several years. And some of those organizations that have done that in a formal way by getting gap assessments completed against, for example, the NIST cybersecurity framework, or going for a full certification under the ISO 27000 series for information security program management systems, or other audit frameworks, could certainly use these the output and the deliverables from those as a way to kind of jumpstart your self-assessment process to see where you stack up against the 800-171 and CMMC requirements, and then go about putting together how you would satisfy the evidence requirement. So when the CMMC assessor comes into your organization to do the assessment for a particular certification along the CMMC maturity scale, they're going to want to see evidence, right, of each of these controls. And so making sure that you can produce evidence that will meet those requirements is going to be important. And one companion document to 800-171 is 800-171A as an alpha, 171A, which is assessing security requirements for CUI. So that document is a great resource because it goes through all the controls within 800-171 and actually gives you examples of the type of evidence that you could produce or provide to show that you meet that particular requirement. And so if you go through this process and leverage some of your previous gap assessments and external assessments or audits that you've gone through, that will help you kind of jumpstart that self-assessment process so that you can find out where you need to not just improve your program, but also where you need to do a better job at gathering sufficient evidence that's going to need to be provided during the actual assessment process. Jim?
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks, Shawn. So I'll put to our other attorneys on the call. Some of the contracting issues that you see relating to 800-171 and CMMC, what are some of those upstream and downstream issues that you're seeing and how they're being addressed? Christine, you want to start off?
Sure. Before I start off, there's one question that I wanted to address. There's a question about what's the minimum level of CMMC that contractors should be certified at. I think the answer to that is it depends. It depends entirely, which is a frustrating answer, but it depends entirely on what kind of information you're handling and what your company's or institution's role is in handling that information and protecting that information. I think the CMMC guidelines, the government's expectations when it rolled out CMMC was that most contractors would be at level 1, which is compliance with FAR 52204-21 requirement for protecting, transmitting federal contract information, which is not CUI. And that's what a lot of the literature put out by the government focuses on, how small businesses can achieve level 1. For businesses that are doing a lot more with CUI, I think the expectation is generally a minimum of a level 3. Level 2 is often seen as a transitional level where a company may be working towards level 3 certification, where it can be working with more CUI and be a trusted partner to handle CUI. So as far as moving to upstream and downstream contracting issues, Jeff talked a lot about some of the issues earlier in his section, but some of the other things you want to focus on, I think the first thing is a contractor needs to understand the scope and their role in the contract, and the scope of the data that's coming from the government and what they might produce. As I think everyone has talked about, Jeff, Shawn, and Jim have talked about, the contractor will be creating some CUI depending on the type of contract. Jim said, provide the example of design specifications. If you're building some piece of machinery for the government and they're not giving you design specifications, maybe it's a performance specification, and your company is trying to figure out how to build it, then you're creating in the engineering process information that would be CUI. And then obviously the company is going to need to figure out how to protect that, how to make its systems comply to protect that CUI. if you're a subcontractor that's not managing CUI at all, maybe there's a clause in your contract that requires a certain CMMC level, but it's possible that the prime might require a CMMC level of a 4 or a 3, but the subs don't require that. So there's a lot of focus, I guess, on what your role is with the data involved in the contract. As Jeff touched on earlier, there's also a lot of supply chain considerations. For companies that aren't traditional government contractors, maybe companies that have only a small percentage of their business that involves work with the government, these standards might discourage further work with the government. So if your company looks at these standards and still wants to consider doing business with the government, then there's a lot of self-assessment and need to map out your supply chain, pay a special interest to information, where the government's information is going to travel, where the CUI is going. Do you have support services that are offshore? Do you have pieces of your information security infrastructure that come from foreign countries or foreign suppliers, and who is producing that? And are they companies that the government has singled out as security concerns, or are they more traditional allied countries? There's also some export control concerns. If you have a subcontract relating to CUI that's performed in a foreign country, maybe you can't hire local IT support to set the system up, or there's lots of concerns like that might not be obvious on the surface of the contract, but when you're thinking through and dealing with CUI, these are considerations. Jeff, I think you had some more to add on this section.
Yeah, real briefly, I know we're getting short on time, and I just want to let everyone make sure they have their say. But a couple things very few things with respect to what we've been talking about. Again, make sure, Christine started off her comments, and I'm amazed how often I say this when I talk to groups about government contract issues, whatever they are, is read your contract or your subcontract, because make sure these clauses are in your contract, and make sure you have an obligation to comply with these clauses. That's quite important in terms of just from an overall compliance perspective. There is an exception, a commercial off-the-shelf exception here. There's not a commercial item exception, and those are two different terms in the government contracts world. For those of you familiar with the FAR, you can check FAR 2.101, and you can see what those definitions are. But there is a COTS, commercial off-the-shelf exception, but not a commercial item exception. And from the looks of the participants on the call, the attendees on the call, I'm not sure we have that many COTS providers here. So these clauses are going to most likely apply to each and every one of you. And so let me turn it back over to Jim for his comments as well.
No, I think those are excellent comments. I think what a lot of entities are thinking about now is, okay, so this stuff might apply to us, or whether by contract or by law. How do we limit some of these risks? How do we make it so that we don't have to? We're not getting audited for absolutely every system we have. And for that, I'd ask Jeff or any of our speakers if you have thoughts about how you can limit the risks here.
Well, I think, first and foremost, I think you need to go through the assessment of, does the CUI, do these CUI requirements apply to you as an organization? If they do, then you have to put the appropriate controls in place and to sort of to minimize the disruption to the company. I mean, Shawn, mentioned it. I mean, there are third-party providers who, like Shawn, who, provide these assessment services, for these companies. Many times, this, as I said, is a complex area, and I think, sort of to undertake it on your own, sometimes, is, penny wise and pound foolish, because, you're potentially opening up a whole host of other compliance risks and exposure if you don't handle this sort of assessment and the other CMMC guidelines, or requirements for that matter, properly. And so I think it's very important to, one, as I said, inaction is not a solution. You need to first determine, are these requirements applicable to you? In most cases, and for most of the folks on the phone here, I dare say they probably are. And then the next question is, okay, well, how do you deal with it without disrupting the entire organization? And as I mentioned, there are plenty of tools online to sort of get you started, but to really understand these requirements requires you to sort of take a deep dive into the regulations themselves and the other standards that are out there. And, in order to do so, you sometimes have to navigate tricky areas, and those could be, what if you don't have a perfect 110 score? Do you submit? Do you submit your response on the contractor report, or do you sort of, remediate and then submit, a month later? Or maybe it's going to take you more than a month. So now you have 6 months of trying to figure out what the roadmap's going to be to solve your compliance shortfalls. How do you deal with that issue? And so sometimes it's good to have a third party come in and help with that process. But I think overall, the key here is that, Jim, to your point, is you need to, embrace these requirements. And again, if in fact you are dealing in CUI, you need to make sure you have the proper controls in place. And once again, you don't want to sort of oversaturate the landscape with controls that you don't need. But on the other hand, you want to make sure you're doing exactly what is required under the regulations.
Thanks very much, Jeff. And I would note that we're coming to the end of our time. We're going to run up against our time limit here in just a moment. I'd like to thank everyone for participating. We have several questions that we've not been able to get to so far. We hopefully will be able to email you some questions or reach out to you to discuss it a little bit more. Thanks so much for participating in the webinar. We want your feedback. Let us know if there are topics you'd like to hear about, including going more into depth about some of this topic or some of the subtopics that we were only able to discuss kind of at a high level today. If there's things that we can drill down into more, let us know. We do these monthly, and we'd love to get into it in greater depth. Please complete and submit the survey that's in the widget at the bottom of the screen. And thanks again for attending, and we hope to see you on another webinar. And thanks very much to our speakers for participating today. Thanks very much.